Imagine discovering a collection of clay tablets so ancient that they were already thousands of years old when Moses is traditionally believed to have lived. Buried beneath the dust of Mesopotamia, written in wedge-shaped symbols that remained unreadable for nearly 2 millennia, these tablets speak of mysterious beings called the Anunnaki. Kings claimed they descended from them. Priests offered sacrifices in their honor. Entire civilizations built towering temples because they believed these powerful figures determined the fate of humanity. Now here's the question that refuses to disappear. What if the Bible never ignored these beings? What if it described them just under another name? That possibility has fueled endless debates. Documentaries have turned the Anunnaki into extraterrestrials. Best-selling books have portrayed them as genetic engineers who created humanity. Internet forums insist ancient governments hid the truth, while television specials promise that archaeology is on the verge of rewriting everything we know about civilization. But when I began reading the original evidence, not the sensational headlines, but the actual translations from Sumerian tablets, Akkadian inscriptions, biblical manuscripts, and early Jewish writings, I realized something surprising. The real story is far stranger than most conspiracy theories. And in many ways, it's far more fascinating. Because this isn't simply a mystery about ancient gods. It's a mystery about memory. How did different civilizations remember encounters with the divine? Why do cultures separated by geography and language preserve stories of heavenly beings descending to earth? Why do some accounts describe wisdom brought from above while others warn of catastrophic rebellion? Are these merely myths evolving independently, or are they fragments of an older tradition remembered from different perspectives? Those questions have challenged historians, archaeologists, theologians, and linguists for generations. I'll be honest, the deeper I researched this subject, the more careful I became. Because there's a huge difference between asking difficult questions and forcing evidence to fit a predetermined conclusion. Today, countless videos confidently declare that the Anunnaki were alien visitors. Others dismiss the entire subject as fantasy. Neither extreme does justice to the historical record. The truth deserves something better. So today, we're going to set aside the sensationalism. We're going back to the oldest surviving texts humanity has ever written. We're going to examine what the Sumerians actually believed. We're going to compare those beliefs with the Hebrew scriptures. We'll explore the mysterious sons of God described in Genesis. We'll investigate the Watchers from the Book of Enoch. We'll examine why the Nephilim continue to spark fierce debate among biblical scholars. We'll look at the Babylonian exile and how ancient Israel encountered the religious world of Mesopotamia. We'll also confront one of the biggest modern questions. Could different civilizations have been describing similar supernatural realities using completely different names? Notice the wording. Not identical stories. Not identical beings. Similar realities. That's a much more responsible question, and one historians are actually willing to discuss. Because if there's one lesson archaeology teaches us, it's this. Ancient cultures borrowed ideas from one another. They reshaped stories. They adapted traditions. They reinterpreted older narratives to fit new religious worldviews. That doesn't automatically mean they copied one another. Nor does it mean every similarity proves a hidden conspiracy. Sometimes civilization simply wrestled with the same mysteries. Where did humanity come from? Why does evil exist? Why did advanced civilization suddenly emerge? Who or what stands behind the unseen world? The Bible answers those questions one way. Ancient Mesopotamia answers them another. And somewhere between those answers lies one of history's most intriguing conversations. You're probably wondering, if these connections are so interesting, why aren't they discussed more often? Actually, they are. just not in the way social media usually presents them. Universities publish entire volumes comparing the Hebrew Bible with ancient Near Eastern literature. Scholars spend decades translating damaged tablets from archaeological excavations. Museums preserve thousands of cuneiform fragments that continue to reshape our understanding of the ancient world. The challenge isn't a lack of information. It's separating evidence from imagination. Because once speculation enters the conversation, facts often become blurred. One misunderstood translation becomes a viral headline. One damaged tablet becomes proof of impossible technology. One mysterious biblical verse becomes the foundation for an elaborate theory that the original authors never intended. We're going to avoid that trap. Whenever scholars disagree, I'll tell you they disagree. Whenever evidence is uncertain, we'll acknowledge the uncertainty. And whenever ancient texts genuinely raise difficult questions, we won't pretend the answers are simple. Because history rarely is. The ancient world wasn't black and white. It was layered, complicated, sometimes frustratingly incomplete. Yet that's precisely what makes this journey worthwhile. Over the next several chapters, we'll walk through forgotten cities whose names once ruled the world. Eridu, Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh. We'll meet kings who believed heaven had chosen them, priests who claimed to speak for divine assemblies, prophets who challenged entire empires, and biblical writers who boldly declared that above every earthly kingdom stood one sovereign creator unlike any god worshipped by the surrounding nations. And by the time we reach the end of this investigation, you'll have enough historical context to answer the central question for yourself. Were the Anunnaki truly the same beings the Bible describes under another name? Or are the similarities simply echoes of neighboring civilizations, trying to explain the same ancient mysteries through completely different theological lenses? That's exactly where our investigation begins. Because before we can compare the Anunnaki with the Bible, we first need to understand who the Anunnaki actually were. Long before the pyramids of Egypt dominated the horizon, before the great kingdoms of Israel and Judah existed, and centuries before the Roman Empire was even imaginable, another civilization was already flourishing between two mighty rivers. The Greeks would later call this region Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers. Today, much of it lies within modern-day Iraq. To the people who lived there, however, it was simply home, the birthplace of cities, writing, monumental temples, and some of humanity's earliest recorded history. This is where our story truly begins. Not with aliens, not with secret laboratories, not with advanced spacecraft hidden beneath the desert sands. It begins with farmers, merchants, priests, kings, and scribes pressing tiny wedge-shaped marks into soft clay while it was still wet. Those marks, known today as cuneiform, became humanity's first widely used writing system. Thousands upon thousands of these clay tablets have survived because they were accidentally preserved when ancient cities burned. Fire, which destroyed wooden buildings and cloth manuscripts, baked the clay into something almost as durable as stone. Think about that for a moment. Entire libraries survived because cities were destroyed. History can be strangely ironic. Among those surviving tablets are hymns, royal inscriptions, legal codes, business records, myths, prayers, astronomical observations, and epic poems. Together, they provide an extraordinary window into a civilization that existed more than 5,000 years ago. They also introduce us to a vast supernatural world populated by gods, goddesses, divine messengers, monsters, and celestial assemblies. One name appears again and again: the Anunnaki. But here's where modern discussions often go off the rails. The word Anunnaki did not originally mean ancient astronauts. It did not automatically refer to extraterrestrial visitors from another planet. Those ideas are modern interpretations that became popular only in recent decades. If we're going to understand these ancient texts honestly, we have to begin where the Sumerians themselves began. The name is generally understood to mean something like the offspring of En, or those of royal seed, and was the supreme sky deity in Sumerian religion, associated with the highest heavens and ultimate divine authority. The Anunnaki were therefore viewed as members of the heavenly order, powerful divine beings connected to his authority. Notice something important. The texts don't always describe them the same way. Sometimes they appear as judges deciding the destinies of gods and humans alike. In other passages, they are associated with the underworld. Elsewhere, they function as members of a divine council surrounding the highest deity. Like many ancient religious traditions, Sumerian beliefs developed over centuries. Different cities emphasized different gods, different myths, and different theological ideas. That's completely normal. Even within the Bible itself, later books often expand on themes introduced much earlier. Ancient religions weren't frozen in time. They evolved as kingdoms rose and fell, as cultures interacted, and as political power shifted from one city to another. The Anunnaki were no exception. To understand why, we need to meet the civilization that first spoke about them. The Sumerians didn't think of themselves as inventors of civilization, yet modern historians often describe them that way. Around the late 4th millennium BC, cities such as Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur grew into complex urban centers unlike anything the world had previously seen. Massive irrigation systems transformed dry landscapes into fertile farmland. Skilled craftsmen produced intricate jewelry and tools. Trade routes stretched hundreds of miles, connecting distant peoples through commerce. Most impressive of all were the temples. Towering structures called ziggurats rose above the surrounding cities, visible from miles away. These weren't simply places of worship. They were economic centers, administrative headquarters, and symbols of the relationship between heaven and earth. Priests believed the gods had established order, and maintaining that order required continual rituals, offerings, and ceremonies. Religion wasn't separated from daily life. It was woven into everything. Planting crops, building homes, choosing kings, even declaring war. Everything happened under the watchful eyes of the divine. That worldview helps explain why the Anunnaki mattered so much. To the Sumerians, these weren't distant philosophical concepts. They were active participants in the structure of reality itself. Kings frequently claimed their authority came from the gods. Victory in battle wasn't merely military success. It was evidence of divine favor. Droughts, floods, epidemics, and prosperity all reflected the decisions of supernatural powers operating beyond human understanding. Sound familiar? It should. The ancient Israelites also viewed history through a deeply theological lens. Military victories, famines, exile, restoration, all were interpreted as expressions of God's sovereignty rather than random historical events. Already, we can see an important similarity. Not in theology, not in doctrine, but in worldview. Both civilizations believed history unfolded under supernatural authority. The difference lies in who exercised that authority. For the Sumerians, divine power belonged to a vast assembly of gods with varying responsibilities and personalities. For the biblical authors, ultimate authority belonged to one sovereign creator, while every other spiritual being remained subordinate to him. That distinction may seem subtle now. By the end of this investigation, it will become one of the most important differences of all. Because many people assume the Bible and Mesopotamian religion simply describe the same supernatural beings using different names. But do they? Or are we comparing two fundamentally different visions of the unseen world? The answer begins with understanding how the Sumerians imagined heaven itself, and why their stories of divine councils would later invite fascinating comparisons with passages found in the Hebrew scriptures. In the next section, we'll step inside those ancient myths, examine the hierarchy of the Mesopotamian gods, and discover why some scholars believe these divine assemblies provide an essential backdrop for understanding some of the Bible's most mysterious passages. To understand the Anunnaki, we have to leave behind modern assumptions and step into the mind of an ancient Sumerian. Imagine standing in the bustling city of Nippur around 2500 BC. The air is thick with dust from construction. Merchants call out prices in crowded marketplaces. Farmers arrive with grain harvested from fields nourished by the Tigris and Euphrates. Above everything else rises a massive ziggurat, a towering temple that dominates the skyline. To us, it's architecture. To them, it was a meeting place between heaven and earth. The Sumerians believed the universe was carefully ordered. At the highest level stood En, the god of the heavens. Below him was Enlil, associated with authority, kingship, and the atmosphere. Then came Enki, known for wisdom, craftsmanship, and fresh water. Alongside them were powerful deities such as Inanna, Udu, Nana, and many others, each governing different aspects of life and the natural world. The Anunnaki existed within this divine hierarchy. But here's something many people don't realize. The ancient texts don't present the Anunnaki as a single group with one fixed job description. Instead, they appear in different roles depending on the story being told. In one myth, they gather as a council to determine the destinies of gods and humans. In another, they witness divine judgments. Some later traditions even associate them with the underworld, serving as judges over the dead. In other words, the Anunnaki are less like one specific character and more like a governing assembly within the divine realm. That idea might sound strangely familiar, because the Bible also contains passages describing what appears to be a heavenly council. Take the opening chapters of the Book of Job. The text describes the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord. Among them comes the accuser, often identified as Satan. The scene isn't chaotic. It's orderly, structured, deliberate. Heavenly beings stand before the sovereign Creator as he presides over the affairs of the cosmos. Or consider Psalm 82, one of the most debated passages in the Old Testament. It opens with a striking image. God stands in the divine assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. For centuries, interpreters have wrestled with those words. Who are these gods? Are they idols? Human judges? Angelic beings? Members of a heavenly court? Scholars continue to debate the answer, but one thing is clear. The biblical writers were comfortable using courtroom imagery to describe the unseen world. God is portrayed as the supreme judge, surrounded by other spiritual beings who remain accountable to him. Now be careful not to jump ahead. This doesn't mean the Bible is secretly talking about the Anunnaki. Not yet. The similarity we're noticing is literary and conceptual, not necessarily theological. Ancient cultures often imagined heaven as a royal court because earthly kings ruled from courts of their own. It was a natural way to describe divine authority. Still, the comparison raises an intriguing possibility. Could the biblical authors have been responding to ideas already circulating throughout the ancient Near East? Many historians think so. By the time the Israelites emerged as a distinct people, Mesopotamian civilization had already shaped the intellectual landscape of the region for centuries. Stories traveled with merchants. Empires spread languages. Conquering armies carried religious traditions wherever they went. Ideas didn't remain isolated within national borders. The ancient world was deeply interconnected. This doesn't mean every culture copied another. Rather, they often shared common questions while arriving at different answers. One of those questions concerned humanity's place in creation. According to several Mesopotamian myths, humans were created to relieve the gods of labor. The divine beings grew weary of maintaining the world themselves, so humanity was fashioned to perform agricultural work, build cities, and provide offerings through temple worship. It's a practical explanation. Humanity exists to serve the gods. Now compare that with Genesis. The first chapter of the Bible presents an entirely different picture. Humans are created not because God is tired, nor because he needs servants to provide food or labor. Instead, men and women are made in the image of God. They're entrusted with stewardship over creation, invited into relationship with their Creator, and given dignity unlike anything found in surrounding mythologies. The contrast is remarkable. Both traditions describe humanity's beginning, but they tell fundamentally different stories about human purpose. In one, people exist because the gods require assistance. In the other, people exist because a loving creator freely chooses to share his creation with them. That distinction changes everything. It also reminds us why careful comparison matters. Superficial similarities can be fascinating, but deeper examination often reveals profound differences. This is one reason many biblical scholars caution against saying, the Anunnaki are simply the same as the biblical angels, or the Watchers are obviously the Anunnaki. History is rarely that simple. Religious traditions borrow imagery, adapt language, and respond to neighboring cultures, yet they also redefine those ideas in powerful ways. The Bible doesn't merely repeat Mesopotamian religion. Again and again, it challenges it. It takes familiar concepts, a heavenly court, divine beings, creation, kingship, and reshapes them around one revolutionary claim. There is only one true sovereign over heaven and earth. Every other spiritual being, however powerful, exists under his authority. As we'll soon discover, that claim becomes especially significant when we reach one of the Bible's most mysterious passages, Genesis 6. Because hidden within just a few verses is a description of the sons of God, the Nephilim, an event so enigmatic that they've sparked debate for more than 2,000 years. And for many readers, that's where the comparison with the Anunnaki becomes impossible to ignore. If you've spent any time watching documentaries or scrolling through videos about ancient mysteries, you've probably noticed something. The moment the Anunnaki are mentioned, the conversation often jumps straight to extraordinary claims. They created humanity. They engineered human DNA. They came from another planet. They ruled the earth before recorded history. It's dramatic, it's entertaining, and I'll admit it makes for compelling storytelling. But here's the problem. When historians and Assyriologists, the scholars who specialize in ancient Mesopotamia, translate the original cuneiform tablets, they don't find those claims stated in the way modern popular culture often presents them. That's an important distinction. The Anunnaki certainly occupy a central place in Mesopotamian religion. They are powerful. They are feared. They influence kings and kingdoms. They participate in divine assemblies. But the image of the Anunnaki as technologically advanced extraterrestrials is a modern interpretation, not the consensus reading of the ancient texts. So where did that idea come from? Much of it can be traced to the work of Zecharia Sitchin, whose books became enormously popular during the late 20th century. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were visitors from a distant planet called Nibiru, and that they genetically modified early humans to create a labor force. His theories captured the imagination of millions. Television producers loved them. Internet forums exploded with speculation. Entire YouTube channels were built around them. Yet when professional linguists examined his translations, many reached a very different conclusion. They argued that Sitchin often assigned meanings to Sumerian words that aren't supported by mainstream dictionaries or grammatical analysis. In other words, his conclusions depended on translations that most experts in the field simply don't accept. Now, does that automatically mean every question disappears? No. History isn't settled by popularity contests. But it does remind us of something crucial. There's a difference between asking, "Could there be another interpretation?" and declaring, "This interpretation is unquestionably true." The first is scholarship. The second is certainty without sufficient evidence. Throughout this series, we're going to stay on the first path, because the authentic history is already extraordinary. Consider this. The Sumerians believed their earliest kings ruled for impossibly long periods of time. One ancient document, known today as the Sumerian King List, records reigns lasting tens of thousands of years before a catastrophic flood changed history forever. Does that sound familiar? It should. Genesis also describes remarkably long lifespans before the flood. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Methuselah, Noah. The similarities immediately catch the attention of researchers. Both traditions remember an ancient world unlike our own. Both preserve stories of a devastating flood. Both describe humanity's earliest generations as different from those living afterward. Coincidence? Shared cultural memory. Independent traditions describing separate events. Those are exactly the questions scholars continue to debate. What's fascinating is that Mesopotamia wasn't the only civilization preserving flood traditions. Ancient cultures from across the Near East told stories about overwhelming waters that reshaped human history. The biblical account of Noah is unique in its theology, but it emerged in a world where flood narratives were already well known. Rather than hiding this fact, modern biblical scholarship studies these parallels carefully. Why? Because comparing ancient texts often reveals what makes each one distinctive. For example, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of Utnapishtim, a man who survives a great flood after being warned by a god. The similarities with Noah are obvious. A divine warning, a massive vessel, animals preserved, a global catastrophe, birds sent out to search for dry land. But then the stories begin to diverge. The motivations of the gods are different. The character of the deity is different. The purpose of the flood is different. Even the ending carries a completely different theological message. Again and again, we encounter the same pattern. Shared themes, different meanings. That observation will become increasingly important when we compare the Anunnaki with biblical beings later in this series. Because similarities alone don't prove identity. Imagine finding two ancient kingdoms that both crown their rulers with gold. Would that mean they worship the same gods? Not necessarily. Shared symbols can emerge from shared human experience without implying identical beliefs. The same principle applies here. Now here's where things become even more intriguing. The Israelites didn't live in complete isolation from Mesopotamia. Far from it. One of the defining events in biblical history was the Babylonian exile during the 6th century BC. Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed. Thousands of Judeans were taken to Babylon. For decades, God's people lived in the heart of the very civilization whose ancestors had preserved stories of the Anunnaki, the flood, divine councils, and ancient kings. Think about the implications. Jewish scribes walked the streets of Babylon. They saw its temples. They heard its languages. They encountered its religious traditions firsthand. Yet instead of abandoning their faith, they doubled down on one astonishing declaration. The God of Israel alone created heaven and earth. Not Lil, not Marduk, not the Anunnaki, only Yahweh. That bold claim set biblical theology apart from every surrounding empire. And it also explains why the Hebrew scriptures sometimes sound like they're answering ideas found in neighboring cultures. Not copying them, responding to them, correcting them, replacing them with a radically different vision of reality. As we move into the next chapter, we'll examine perhaps the most mysterious passage in the entire Bible, Genesis 6. Just a handful of verses. Yet those verses introduce the sons of God, the Nephilim, and a series of events so puzzling that they've divided interpreters for centuries. And it's there, more than anywhere else, that many people believe the paths of the Anunnaki and the Bible begin to cross. If there is one passage in the entire Bible that has generated more debate than almost any other, it is found just 4 chapters before Noah enters the ark. Only 4 verses. That's all. 4 short verses tucked into the opening pages of Genesis, yet they have inspired thousands of books, countless sermons, scholarly debates, documentaries, and more internet theories than perhaps any other section of Scripture. Read them slowly. When mankind began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of humans and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. That's it. No explanation. No glossary. No footnotes. Genesis simply presents the account, as though its original audience already understood exactly who these mysterious sons of God were. But we don't. And that's where centuries of debate begin. I'll admit something. The first time I seriously studied this passage, I expected to find a straightforward answer. Surely after 2,000 years, biblical scholars had reached a consensus. They haven't. In fact, the disagreement is almost as fascinating as the text itself. Today, 3 major interpretations dominate the discussion. Each has respected defenders. Each attempts to explain the evidence, and each raises difficult questions that refuse to disappear. Let's examine them one by one. The first view, the angelic interpretation. This is perhaps the oldest surviving interpretation. According to many ancient Jewish writers, the sons of God were not human at all. They were heavenly beings, angels, or more precisely, members of God's heavenly court who crossed a boundary they were never meant to cross. Supporters of this view point to the phrase, sons of God, elsewhere in the Old Testament. In the Book of Job, for example, the exact expression refers to heavenly beings presenting themselves before God. The same idea appears in other poetic passages describing God's celestial court. If Genesis uses the phrase consistently, then the conclusion seems obvious. The sons of God are supernatural beings. This interpretation became enormously influential in Second Temple Judaism, the period between the Old and New Testaments. Ancient readers didn't seem confused by Genesis 6 because they believed another book explained it in much greater detail. That book was the Book of Enoch. We'll devote an entire chapter to Enoch later, because its influence on early Jewish thought cannot be overstated. For now, it's enough to know that Enoch expands Genesis into an epic story. 200 heavenly watchers descend to earth. They swear an oath together. They marry human women. Their children become giants. They teach forbidden knowledge, metalworking, occult practices, astrology, enchantments, and warfare. Human society collapses into violence. The flood follows as divine judgment. Sound familiar? Many readers immediately notice echoes of Mesopotamian traditions. Heavenly beings, ancient heroes, a world before the flood, a catastrophic judgment. It's no wonder people begin asking whether Genesis and the stories of the Anunnaki are somehow connected. But before jumping to conclusions, we need to keep reading, because another interpretation argues something entirely different. The second view, the line of Seth. This interpretation became increasingly popular among many early Christian theologians. Instead of angels marrying humans, it suggests that the sons of God were faithful descendants of Seth, the son born to Adam and Eve after Abel's death. According to this view, Genesis contrasts two family lines. The descendants of Cain gradually become corrupt and violent. The descendants of Seth continue worshiping God. Eventually, the righteous line begins intermarrying with the wicked line. The result: moral corruption spreads throughout humanity. Supporters argue this interpretation avoids several theological problems. After all, Jesus says in the Gospels that angels in heaven neither marry nor are given in marriage. Could spiritual beings even produce biological children? That's a difficult question. The Sethite interpretation says the answer is no. Genesis, therefore, describes human rebellion rather than angelic rebellion. It's an elegant solution, yet it also faces challenges. Why would faithful descendants of Seth suddenly be called sons of God when Genesis never explicitly labels them that way elsewhere? And why would ordinary human marriages produce the mysterious Nephilim? Those questions continue to fuel debate. The third view, ancient kings and tyrants. A third interpretation takes a different approach altogether. In the ancient Near East, kings frequently claimed divine ancestry. Egyptian pharaohs were called sons of gods. Mesopotamian rulers often described themselves as chosen by heaven. Some biblical scholars therefore argue that Genesis criticizes powerful rulers who abused their authority. These sons of God weren't angels. They weren't simply descendants of Seth. They were arrogant kings claiming divine status, taking any women they desired, and filling the earth with violence. In this reading, Genesis becomes a condemnation of political corruption rather than supernatural rebellion. It's historically plausible. It fits what we know about ancient royal ideology. But once again, not everyone is convinced, because the language of Genesis still sounds unusually supernatural. And that brings us back to the central mystery. Who or what were these sons of God? The truth is, the text doesn't tell us as plainly as we might wish. Instead, it invites us into one of the oldest biblical debates in history. And as we'll soon discover, the answer may depend not only on Genesis itself, but also on ancient Jewish writings that almost made it into the Bible. One of the biggest mistakes we can make when reading Genesis 6 is assuming that the original audience approached the passage the same way we do today. They didn't. When we read these verses, we immediately ask questions like, who exactly were the sons of God? Were they angels? Were they human rulers? Who were the Nephilim? The ancient Israelites certainly asked difficult questions too, but they were also reading within a cultural world that already accepted the existence of an unseen spiritual realm. For them, the idea that heaven interacted with earth wasn't strange, it was expected. The mystery wasn't whether God had created spiritual beings. That was taken for granted. The mystery was whether some of those beings had crossed boundaries established by their Creator. And this is where Genesis becomes remarkably restrained. Think about it. Modern writers love details. If Hollywood told this story, we'd probably get a 2-hour film explaining every character, every battle, every supernatural event. We'd know the names of the beings involved, the mechanics of what happened, and dramatic visual effects would fill every scene. Genesis does the opposite. It gives us almost nothing, just enough information to tell us something extraordinary occurred before the flood. Nothing more. That silence has fascinated readers for thousands of years. Why say so little about something that seems so important? Some scholars believe the author intentionally avoided expanding the story because his audience already knew the surrounding traditions. Others argue that Genesis deliberately minimizes the event because the focus of the narrative isn't the supernatural beings at all. It's humanity's growing corruption. That's an important observation. The Bible consistently shifts attention away from the spectacular and back toward God's purposes. Where surrounding cultures often celebrated powerful semi-divine heroes, Genesis moves quickly to human responsibility and divine judgment. Notice what happens immediately after the mysterious account of the sons of God. God declares, "My spirit shall not abide in mankind forever. Their days shall be 120 years." Then comes an even more sobering statement. The Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great upon the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. That's the real emphasis. Not the identity of the sons of God. Not the biology of the Nephilim. Human wickedness. Violence. Corruption. A world unraveling under the weight of sin. In other words, Genesis refuses to let our curiosity distract us from its central message. Still, that curiosity hasn't disappeared. Far from it. If anything, it's grown stronger over the centuries. Part of the reason lies in a single Hebrew word. Nephilim. It's one of the rarest words in the entire Old Testament. In fact, outside Genesis 6, it appears only once more in the Book of Numbers. There, Israelite spies returned from exploring Canaan with a terrifying report. We saw the Nephilim there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight. Immediately, readers begin making connections. The same mysterious name, again associated with unusually formidable people, again surrounded by fear and uncertainty. Were these the same beings? Their descendants? Or were the frightened spies exaggerating what they saw? Even among biblical scholars, opinions differ. The Hebrew root of Nephilim is often connected with the idea of falling, leading some to translate the word as fallen ones. Others argue the linguistic evidence isn't strong enough to support that conclusion. Some suggest the term refers simply to exceptionally powerful warriors. Others maintain it describes giants. The Greek translators of the Old Testament, working centuries before the time of Christ, rendered the word as gigants, a term that eventually became giants in many English Bibles. But here's where things become interesting. The Greek word didn't necessarily mean gigantic in height. It could also describe mighty or earth-born warriors of legendary strength. So even the ancient translators were interpreting the text, not merely copying vocabulary. Translation always involves choices. Sometimes those choices shape history. Imagine reading Genesis for the first time with the word giants already fixed in your mind. Instantly, your imagination fills with towering figures of enormous size. Now imagine reading the same passage without that translation. Suddenly, the focus shifts. Perhaps these were famous warriors. Perhaps legendary rulers. Perhaps something else entirely. One word changes everything. This reminds us to approach ancient texts with humility. The farther back we travel into history, the more careful we must become. Languages evolve. Words carry multiple meanings. Context matters. That's why responsible scholarship rarely offers simplistic answers. Instead, it weighs possibilities. It compares manuscripts. It studies archaeology. It asks how the earliest readers understood the text. And when certainty isn't possible, it admits uncertainty. Ironically, that's often where the most exciting discoveries begin. Because once we acknowledge what we don't know, we're finally ready to examine what ancient Jewish readers believed had happened before the flood. Their answer wasn't hidden in Genesis. It was preserved in another remarkable book, a book quoted by early Christian writers, a book treasured among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a book that expands those mysterious 4 verses into one of the most dramatic supernatural narratives ever written. The Book of Enoch. And whether you view it as inspired scripture, valuable history, or influential ancient literature, one fact cannot be denied. Without understanding Enoch, it's almost impossible to understand why Genesis 6 has captivated readers for more than 2,000 years. In the next chapter, we'll open that extraordinary text and discover why its story of the Watchers transformed the way generations of Jews and early Christians understood the mysterious sons of God. Imagine walking into a library where one of the most influential books in ancient Judaism has been missing for more than 1,000 years. Church fathers quoted it. Early Christians knew it. Ancient Jewish communities copied it by hand. Fragments of it were carefully preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yet for centuries, much of the Western world believed it had vanished forever. That book is the Book of Enoch. And whether you consider it inspired scripture or simply an important piece of ancient religious literature, one thing is undeniable. It completely transforms the way many readers understand Genesis 6. I'll be honest. The first time I read Enoch after studying Genesis, I had to stop several times. Not because I immediately believed every detail, but because I suddenly understood why ancient readers weren't confused by those 4 mysterious verses in Genesis. Genesis gives the headline. Enoch tells the story. According to the Book of Enoch, the sons of God were a group of heavenly beings known as the Watchers. Their task was not to rule humanity but to observe it, to watch over creation under God's authority. Even the name is significant. Watchers, not creators, not gods in the ultimate sense. Watchers. They were entrusted with responsibility. And then, according to Enoch, they abandoned it. The narrative begins with a leader named Semjaza. Seeing the beauty of human women, he fears that he alone will be blamed if he carries out his desire. So he gathers 200 watchers and proposes something astonishing. They will all swear an oath together. If every one of them participates, no one can back out. No one can leave the others to face judgment alone. The oath is taken on a mountain called Hermon. From that moment forward, the descent begins. The Watchers leave their appointed place. They take human wives. Children are born. And according to Enoch, those children become giants whose enormous appetites eventually consume everything around them. When food runs out, violence begins. The giants devour livestock, then wild animals. Finally, they turn against humanity itself. The earth, Enoch says, becomes filled with bloodshed. It's an intense narrative. Graphic, tragic, filled with cosmic rebellion rather than simple human failure. But the story doesn't stop there. In fact, the marriages are only the beginning. Enoch claims that the Watchers introduced forbidden knowledge to humanity. One teaches the making of weapons. Another reveals metallurgy. Another teaches astrology. Others introduce enchantments, magical practices, cosmetics, and occult arts. Knowledge itself isn't portrayed as evil. Rather, the problem is knowledge given outside God's appointed order. Knowledge without wisdom, power without holiness, technology without moral restraint. Think about how relevant that idea still feels today. Human history has always wrestled with the same tension. We discover incredible abilities. The question is whether our character matures as quickly as our power. The Book of Enoch argues that before the flood, the answer was no. The result was catastrophe. Now here's something fascinating. This theme isn't unique to Enoch. Ancient cultures around the world preserve stories of heavenly beings teaching forbidden skills to humanity. Greek mythology speaks of Prometheus, who steals fire from the gods. Mesopotamian myths describe divine wisdom being given to kings. Other traditions tell of celestial teachers bringing advanced knowledge to early civilizations. Again, we encounter a familiar pattern. Shared themes, different theology, different conclusions. For Enoch, the lesson is crystal clear. The problem isn't that humanity learned. The problem is that rebellious spiritual beings corrupted the learning process. That distinction matters, because modern ancient alien theories often reverse the story entirely. They portray these heavenly visitors as benefactors, teachers, civilizers, heroes. Enoch presents them as rebels. Their gifts are not blessings. They're evidence of disobedience. That's a profound difference. It also explains why early Jewish readers connected Enoch so naturally with Genesis. In their minds, the corruption before Noah's flood wasn't merely human. It involved both heaven and earth. The rebellion was cosmic. Human sin and spiritual rebellion became intertwined. And once that happened, judgment became unavoidable. This is where another figure enters the story. His name is Azazel. Among all the Watchers, none receives more attention than he does. According to Enoch, Azazel teaches humanity the manufacture of swords, knives, shields, armor, and instruments of war. He also reveals techniques associated with vanity and deception. The result: violence spreads across the earth. Wars increase. Human hearts become increasingly corrupt. The picture is symbolic, theological, and deeply moral. Enoch isn't simply explaining where weapons came from. He's illustrating how knowledge divorced from obedience becomes destructive. Power magnifies whatever already exists in the human heart. If the heart is corrupt, greater power produces greater destruction. That's a lesson as relevant in the age of artificial intelligence and nuclear weapons as it was in the ancient world. But perhaps the most dramatic part of Enoch's account is still to come. Because eventually, heaven responds. God sends archangels to investigate what has happened on earth. The cries of humanity have reached his throne. Judgment is coming, not only for wicked people, but for the Watchers themselves. And the punishment described in Enoch would become one of the most influential images in all of Jewish and early Christian thought, an image that echoes unexpectedly in the New Testament itself. The cries of humanity, according to the Book of Enoch, did not simply disappear into the silence. They reached heaven. Picture the scene for a moment. The earth has become unrecognizable. Violence spreads from city to city. Bloodshed replaces justice. Those who were meant to protect creation have instead corrupted it. Humanity, influenced by both its own sinful desires and the rebellion of the Watchers, spirals toward complete moral collapse. Then something remarkable happens. Heaven responds. Enoch describes four great archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, standing before the throne of God. They witness the devastation below and bring humanity's suffering before the Creator. It's one of the most dramatic courtroom scenes in ancient religious literature. The message is simple. God has seen everything. Nothing has escaped his notice. For people living in violent and oppressive societies, that idea carried enormous comfort. Empires might ignore injustice. Kings might abuse their power. Corrupt rulers might believe they would never face consequences. But heaven was watching. Justice had not fallen asleep. According to Enoch, God assigns each archangel a specific mission. Raphael is commanded to bind Azazel. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. Literally bind him. Enoch describes Azazel being cast into a desolate wilderness, confined beneath rough stones until the day of final judgment. It's a vivid image of restraint. The rebel who spread corruption across the earth is no longer free to continue his influence. Then comes Semjaza and the other watchers. Their punishment is equally severe. They are bound in darkness beneath the earth, awaiting the day when God's final judgment will be carried out. Now, if that imagery sounds familiar, you're not imagining it. Centuries later, the New Testament contains two astonishing passages that seem to echo this very tradition. The first appears in 2 Peter. Peter writes that God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. Notice the language. Angels, sin, chains, darkness, awaiting judgment. Those are striking parallels. Then comes the short but powerful letter of Jude. Jude says, "The angels who did not keep their proper domain, but abandoned their own dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day." Again, the similarities are difficult to ignore. Many scholars believe Peter and Jude were familiar with the traditions preserved in Enoch. In fact, Jude goes even further. Later in his letter, he directly quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch. That quotation appears almost word for word in the surviving Ethiopian version of the Book of Enoch. Think about what that means. A New Testament author was willing to quote a book that many later Christians would no longer include in their biblical canon. Does that mean Enoch is scripture? Not necessarily. The Apostle Paul quoted Greek poets. The Book of Proverbs quotes wisdom found outside Israel. Quoting a source doesn't automatically elevate it to the level of inspired scripture. But it does tell us something important. Enoch was respected. Its ideas were widely known. Its language shaped the imagination of many Jewish readers living around the time of Jesus. That historical fact alone makes the book incredibly valuable. Even if someone ultimately concludes that Enoch isn't inspired, understanding it helps explain how many first-century Jews interpreted Genesis. And that's precisely why we're studying it. Not to force conclusions, not to blur the distinction between scripture and later literature, but to understand the world in which the biblical authors lived and wrote. Now, here's where the conversation becomes even more interesting. Remember our original question. Could the Anunnaki and the Watchers somehow represent the same ancient memory? At first glance, the similarities are obvious. Both involve heavenly beings. Both are connected to humanity's early history. Both appear before a catastrophic flood. Both describe supernatural figures interacting with the human world. It's tempting to stop there and declare the mystery solved. But responsible history demands more. Because similarities are only half the story. The differences are just as important. In Mesopotamian literature, the Anunnaki are generally part of the established divine order. They govern, judge, and participate in the administration of the cosmos. While individual gods sometimes behave selfishly or violently, the Anunnaki as a group are not primarily remembered for abandoning heaven to marry human women. That role belongs much more clearly to Enoch's watchers. Likewise, the purpose of the stories differs dramatically. Enoch explains the origin of overwhelming corruption before the flood. Mesopotamian myths often explain the organization of the divine world or humanity's relationship to the gods. They're addressing different theological questions. That doesn't erase the parallels. It simply prevents us from making them identical. History is rarely that neat. Imagine hearing two eyewitnesses describe the same storm. One focuses on the lightning. The other remembers the flooding. Both may describe the same event, yet neither tells the entire story. Could something similar be happening here? Perhaps. We can't know for certain. And that's where intellectual honesty matters most. The evidence invites comparison. It does not compel certainty. Still, one question refuses to disappear. If Genesis, Enoch, and ancient Mesopotamian traditions all preserve memories of a world before the flood, could they be drawing from an even older shared tradition, one that predates the civilizations themselves? That's the possibility we'll begin exploring next. Because before we compare the Anunnaki and the Watchers directly, we need to understand the historical world that connected Israel and Babylon. And once those two civilizations collide, the similarities and the differences become even more revealing. Now we arrive at the question that has quietly followed us from the very beginning. Could the Anunnaki and the Watchers be describing the same ancient tradition? It's an attractive idea. On the surface, the similarities seem almost impossible to ignore. Both appear in stories rooted in the world before the flood. Both involve heavenly beings. Both become associated with humanity's earliest history. Both exist within cultures that believed the visible world was deeply connected to an unseen spiritual realm. For many people, that's enough. Case closed. Different names, same beings. But history has a way of humbling our confidence. The deeper we look, the more complicated the picture becomes. Imagine finding two ancient maps of the same mountain. One emphasizes the rivers flowing down its eastern slopes. The other carefully marks the forests covering its western side. At first glance, they seem completely different, but with closer inspection, you realize they're describing the same landscape from different perspectives. Now imagine the opposite. Two maps may share rivers, valleys, and mountains, yet actually depict entirely different regions that merely resemble one another. The challenge is knowing which situation you're facing. That's exactly the challenge historians face with the Anunnaki and the Watchers. Let's begin with what we can say confidently. Both traditions emerged from the broader world of the ancient Near East. They were shaped by neighboring civilizations that traded goods, fought wars, exchanged ideas, and influenced one another over centuries. Israel did not develop in complete isolation, nor did Mesopotamia exist behind an impenetrable wall. Ideas traveled. Languages evolved. Stories crossed borders. That's not speculation. It's history. Archaeologists have uncovered Egyptian artifacts in Canaan. Mesopotamian cylinder seals have been found hundreds of miles from where they were carved. Diplomatic letters reveal kings communicating across vast distances. Merchants carried not only spices, metals, and textiles, but also myths, religious concepts, and political philosophies. The ancient world was surprisingly connected. This matters because similarities between biblical and Mesopotamian literature shouldn't immediately surprise us. Shared geography often produces shared cultural conversations. Think about our own world. Different countries tell stories about dragons. Nearly every civilization preserves flood traditions. Many cultures remember a paradise lost, a great hero, or a catastrophic judgment. Those similarities don't necessarily prove direct borrowing. Sometimes they're the result of common human experiences. Sometimes they reflect historical memories preserved in different forms. Sometimes one culture intentionally responds to another. The real challenge is determining which explanation best fits the evidence. When we compare the Anunnaki with Enoch's Watchers, several similarities immediately stand out. Both involve supernatural beings connected with heaven. Both influence human history. Both appear in narratives concerned with divine order. Both exist within traditions that remember a great flood. Those parallels are real. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. But here's where careful scholarship slows down. The functions of these beings differ in significant ways. The Watchers in Enoch are defined by rebellion. Their identity is inseparable from their disobedience. Everything about the story centers on what they should not have done. They descend without permission. They abandon their appointed place. They corrupt humanity. They face divine judgment. The narrative is fundamentally moral. The Anunnaki, by contrast, are usually presented as part of the established structure of the divine world. They administer, judge, deliberate, and participate in the government of the cosmos. Individual Mesopotamian gods certainly commit questionable acts in various myths, but the Anunnaki as a collective aren't primarily remembered as rebels who left heaven to marry human women. That's an important distinction. If the two traditions truly originated from the same source, they underwent remarkable theological transformation. Could that happen? Absolutely. Religious traditions evolve. Stories are adapted. Ancient memories are reshaped to fit new theological frameworks. The Bible itself occasionally retells earlier events from different perspectives. The books of Kings and Chronicles, for example, often describe the same historical events while emphasizing different themes. Ancient writers weren't concerned with modern expectations of documentary precision. They wrote with theological purpose, which raises another possibility. What if Genesis and Enoch intentionally reinterpreted older cultural memories through the lens of biblical monotheism? In other words, what if the biblical authors took familiar concepts from the surrounding world, not to endorse them, but to redefine them? This idea has become increasingly influential among many scholars. They argue that the Bible frequently engages with neighboring cultures by adopting familiar imagery while radically changing its meaning. Consider creation. Babylonian myths often describe creation emerging from conflict between competing gods. Genesis opens with no divine battle whatsoever. One God speaks. Creation obeys. Order replaces chaos without resistance. The message is unmistakable. Israel's God has no rivals. Or consider the flood. In Mesopotamian stories, the gods sometimes appear divided, emotional, even regretful in ways that reflect human weakness. Genesis presents one sovereign God acting with perfect justice, while simultaneously preserving mercy through Noah. Again, familiar setting. Entirely different theology. Could the same principle apply to heavenly beings? Could Genesis acknowledge the reality of the spiritual realm, while rejecting the pagan understanding of it? Many biblical scholars believe that's exactly what's happening. If they're right, then comparing the Anunnaki and the Watchers isn't about proving they're identical. It's about understanding how the Bible transformed the religious conversations of the ancient world into something profoundly different. And that transformation becomes even clearer once Israel encounters Babylon face to face during one of the darkest chapters in biblical history. the exile. To understand why the similarities between the Anunnaki and the Watchers became so compelling, we have to travel to one of the darkest moments in Israel's history. The year is 586 BC. Jerusalem has fallen. The magnificent temple built by Solomon lies in ruins. Smoke rises from broken walls. Sacred treasures are carried away as trophies of war. Families are separated. Survivors are marched hundreds of miles across the desert into exile. Their destination is Babylon. Imagine the emotional weight of that journey. For generations, Israel had believed Jerusalem was the center of God's covenant with his people. Now the city is gone. Questions filled the air. Had God abandoned them? Were Babylon's gods stronger? Had the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob come to an end? These weren't abstract theological debates. They were matters of survival. When the Jewish exiles arrived in Babylon, they entered one of the most sophisticated civilizations on earth. Towering walls surrounded the city. Massive temples honored gods whose names had echoed across Mesopotamia for centuries. Priests maintained elaborate rituals. Astronomers mapped the heavens with astonishing precision. Royal libraries preserved thousands of clay tablets recording myths, laws, royal decrees, and religious traditions stretching back more than 2,000 years. This was the intellectual heart of the ancient world. If there were ever a place where Israel's faith might have dissolved into the surrounding culture, this was it. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of absorbing Babylonian theology, Israel's writers sharpened their own. The experience of exile didn't weaken biblical monotheism. It strengthened it. Books like Ezekiel, Daniel, and portions of Isaiah proclaim God's sovereignty with remarkable boldness. Even in the heart of Babylon, surrounded by temples dedicated to Marduk and countless other deities, the biblical message remained unwavering. There is one creator, one king, one judge. Every earthly empire, even Babylon itself, answers to him. That conviction changed how Israel interpreted every spiritual claim around them. Consider the opening chapter of the Book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful ruler of his age, believes his kingdom is unstoppable. His armies have conquered nation after nation. His gods appear victorious. But Daniel tells a different story. Babylon did not triumph because Marduk defeated the God of Israel. Babylon succeeded because the God of Israel permitted it as an act of judgment. The difference is enormous. History isn't controlled by competing gods locked in cosmic struggle. History unfolds under the authority of one sovereign Lord, who even uses pagan empires to accomplish his purposes. That worldview quietly dismantles the theological foundation of Mesopotamian religion. The gods of the nations are no longer rival powers. They are subordinate, or in many biblical passages, powerless altogether. This helps explain why later Jewish literature, including books like Enoch, increasingly portrays rebellious spiritual beings not as legitimate divine rulers, but as creatures accountable to God's judgment. The hierarchy has changed. The Creator alone reigns. Everything else is derivative. Everything else is accountable. Now, here's where things become particularly interesting for our investigation. During the exile, Jewish scholars were surrounded by ancient traditions that had developed over centuries. They encountered flood narratives, royal myths, stories of divine councils, and accounts of heavenly beings interacting with humanity. They were exposed to ideas that sounded familiar on the surface, but rested on completely different theological foundations. What did they do with those ideas? They didn't simply erase them, nor did they blindly adopt them. Instead, they engaged them, sometimes by correcting them, sometimes by redefining them. sometimes by presenting the same themes from an entirely different perspective. Think of it like two artists painting the same mountain. They stand in the same valley. They observe the same landscape. Yet one paints a peaceful sunrise, while the other captures an approaching storm. The mountain is real. The interpretation differs. Many modern scholars believe something similar happened in the ancient Near East. Israel and Mesopotamia often reflected on the same fundamental questions. Why is the world broken? Why does evil exist? What happened before the flood? Who governs the unseen realm? But their answers diverged dramatically. Mesopotamian religion described a complex family of gods whose conflicts shaped history. The Bible proclaimed one holy creator, whose justice and mercy governed all things. Enoch expanded Genesis by describing rebellious watchers, whose punishment demonstrated that no spiritual being, however powerful, could escape divine judgment. The theological center shifted. Authority belonged to God alone. Everything else revolved around him. That distinction is easy to overlook if we focus only on surface similarities. Yes, both traditions speak of heavenly beings. Yes, both preserve memories connected with a flood. Yes, both imagine a spiritual world interacting with humanity. But the meaning of those events changes completely depending on the worldview behind them. It's the difference between reading two books that use the same vocabulary while telling entirely different stories. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we've learned so far. The question isn't simply whether the Anunnaki and the Watchers resemble one another. They do in several respects. The deeper question is this: what message was each tradition trying to communicate? Because once we answer that, we begin to see why the Bible refuses to glorify powerful heavenly beings. Instead, it points beyond them, beyond angels, beyond councils, beyond kings, beyond empires, to the one who stands above every throne in heaven and on earth. In the next chapter, we'll leave the world of comparative mythology behind and explore one of the Bible's most overlooked themes, the divine council. We'll examine passages in Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32, Job, and Daniel to discover why Scripture portrays a heavenly assembly while still insisting that only one God is worthy of worship. That chapter will become the key that unlocks everything we've discussed so far. When people hear the word Babylon, they often picture one thing: a city of arrogance, a tower reaching toward heaven, a kingdom that opposed God. And while those images certainly come from the Bible, Babylon was something else as well. It was one of the greatest centers of learning the ancient world had ever seen. Its priests weren't simply religious officials. They were astronomers, mathematicians, record keepers, linguists. For centuries, Babylonian scribes copied ancient texts with remarkable precision. Long before universities existed, temple libraries preserved thousands of clay tablets containing everything from legal contracts and medical observations to hymns, royal inscriptions, and epic literature. Imagine entering one of those archives. Shelf after shelf of clay tablets, some already centuries old. Others copied from manuscripts even older. Stories that stretch back to the earliest days of Sumer. Flood traditions, creation accounts, lists of kings, descriptions of divine assemblies, legends surrounding the Anunnaki. For a Jewish exile living in Babylon, this was more than an impressive collection of literature. It was an encounter with an entirely different way of understanding the world. Now here's an important question. Did Israel simply borrow these stories? Some critics have claimed exactly that. According to this view, the biblical writers merely copied Mesopotamian myths, changed a few names, and presented them as their own sacred history. At first glance, the argument seems persuasive. After all, similarities undeniably exist. Genesis contains a flood. Mesopotamian literature contains a flood. Genesis begins with creation. Babylonian texts describe creation. Both traditions mention humanity's early history. Both remember ancient cities. Both speak about heavenly beings. Case closed. Not quite, because similarities alone don't establish dependence. Let's use a modern example. Imagine two journalists covering the same historical event. One writes for a newspaper in New York. The other writes for a newspaper in London. Naturally, their reports will overlap. They're describing the same event. But each article reflects its own perspective, audience, priorities, and interpretation. Shared subject matter doesn't mean one reporter copied the other. The same principle applies to the ancient Near East. Many scholars now suggest that Israel and Mesopotamia preserved overlapping cultural memories, while interpreting them through radically different theological frameworks. Take the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim surviving a global catastrophe after receiving divine warning. Genesis tells of Noah surviving the flood because God judged a corrupt world while preserving righteousness. The external framework appears similar. A righteous man, a great vessel, animals preserved, birds released after the waters recede. Yet beneath the surface, the stories move in completely different directions. In the Mesopotamian account, the gods themselves disagree. Some regret the destruction, others fear the consequences of their own decisions. The divine world appears divided, emotional, and unpredictable. Genesis offers no such confusion. One sovereign God judges evil. One sovereign God preserves life. One sovereign God establishes a covenant afterward. The difference isn't minor. It's foundational. The biblical writers weren't simply telling an old story. They were redefining its meaning. Now consider creation itself. The famous Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, begins with conflict. The god Marduk defeats the sea goddess Tiamat in a violent battle. He splits her body apart to form heaven and earth. Creation emerges from divine warfare. Genesis opens in breathtaking simplicity. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. No battle. No rival deity. No struggle for supremacy. Darkness covers the deep. God speaks. Light appears. Order unfolds. It's almost as though Genesis quietly rejects the entire worldview behind the surrounding myths. Instead of competing gods battling for power, one creator calmly brings order out of chaos through his word alone. That's revolutionary. And it tells us something important about how the biblical authors engaged neighboring traditions. They didn't ignore them. They answered them. Sometimes directly, sometimes subtly, always theologically. This brings us back to our original investigation. Could the same thing be happening with stories about heavenly beings? Perhaps the biblical authors knew traditions involving divine councils and supernatural assemblies. Perhaps they were familiar with cultural memories preserved in Mesopotamia. But instead of repeating those traditions unchanged, they reframed them. Heaven wasn't governed by competing gods. It was governed by one sovereign Lord. Spiritual beings existed. The Bible never denies that. Angels, cherubim, seraphim, the heavenly host, the sons of God, all appear throughout Scripture. Yet every one of them stands beneath the authority of the Creator. That's the consistent pattern. Again and again, From Genesis to Revelation, no spiritual being shares God's throne. No heavenly council limits his authority. No divine assembly votes on his decisions. The biblical worldview remains radically monotheistic. And that's precisely why many scholars caution against identifying the Anunnaki with biblical beings too quickly. The similarities deserve attention. The differences demand equal attention. Both matter. Ignoring either one distorts history. As we continue our journey, another fascinating question emerges. If the Bible acknowledges a heavenly council while insisting there is only one true God, then who exactly are the other members of that council? That question leads us into one of the most mysterious passages in the Old Testament, Psalm 82, where God stands in the midst of a divine assembly and pronounces judgment upon other heavenly beings. For centuries, theologians have debated its meaning. And as we'll soon discover, understanding that passage may be one of the keys to separating biblical theology from every surrounding mythology. If you've ever wondered why the Bible sometimes sounds familiar to other ancient writings while remaining completely different in its message, the answer may lie in a concept scholars call polemical theology. Don't let the term intimidate you. The idea is actually quite simple. Sometimes the Bible intentionally uses familiar language, not because it agrees with surrounding cultures, but because it wants to challenge them. Think of it as entering someone else's conversation and gently, but firmly, correcting the central assumption. Imagine two architects standing before the same blueprint. One insists the foundation is solid. The other quietly points to a crack running through the middle. At first glance, they're looking at the same building, but they aren't telling the same story. Many biblical scholars believe that's exactly how the Hebrew scriptures engage the religious world of Mesopotamia. The biblical authors knew the claims made by surrounding nations. They understood the stories. They recognized the symbols. Then, instead of pretending those ideas didn't exist, they answered them. One of the clearest examples appears in the opening chapter of Genesis. Ancient Near Eastern cultures often worshiped the sun, moon, and stars as divine beings. Entire temple systems revolved around celestial worship. Kings consulted astrologers before making military decisions. The heavens were viewed as populated by powerful gods whose movements revealed destiny. Now read Genesis carefully. On the fourth day of creation, God makes the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. Have you ever noticed something unusual? Genesis never even names the sun or the moon. Why? Many scholars believe the omission is intentional. The author refuses to give these heavenly bodies the divine status surrounding cultures assigned to them. They aren't gods. They aren't independent powers. They are lights, created objects, servants of the Creator. It's a subtle but devastating theological statement. The same pattern appears again and again throughout Scripture. The sea, feared in many ancient myths as the dwelling place of chaotic divine forces, becomes nothing more than another part of God's creation. Leviathan, often associated with chaos in neighboring cultures, is presented in the Book of Job as a creature that God himself made and completely controls. Even the great monsters of the deep never threaten God's sovereignty. Nothing does. This pattern helps us approach the Anunnaki question with greater clarity. Suppose an Israelite living in Babylon heard stories about powerful heavenly assemblies and divine rulers governing different regions of the cosmos. How might a biblical writer respond? Not by denying the existence of spiritual beings altogether. Scripture plainly acknowledges angels, cherubim, seraphim, and the heavenly host. Instead, the response would likely sound something like this. Yes, spiritual beings exist, but they are not equal to God. They do not share his nature. They do not rival his authority. They are created beings accountable to their creator. That's a fundamentally different worldview, and it's one that echoes throughout both the Old and New Testaments. Consider the dramatic scene in Isaiah 6. The prophet enters the heavenly throne room. Seraphim surround the throne. Their voices shake the foundations of the temple. Smoke fills the sanctuary. It's one of the most awe-inspiring visions in all of Scripture. Yet notice where everyone's attention remains. Not on the seraphim, not on the heavenly court, not on the dazzling supernatural beings. Every eye is fixed on the Lord seated upon his throne. The heavenly beings don't compete for worship. They direct worship toward God. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. That's their song. Not look at us, not fear our power. Only worship, only reverence, only the holiness of God. The same pattern appears in the Book of Revelation. John describes angels beyond counting, living creatures unlike anything found on earth, elders surrounding the throne, thunder, lightning, crystal seas, brilliant colors, an overwhelming heavenly court. And once again, everything centers on God. The supernatural world exists. It is vast. It is glorious. But it never overshadows the one who created it. That's perhaps the greatest difference between biblical theology and many surrounding mythologies. The Bible consistently shifts attention away from created beings and toward the Creator himself. Modern fascination often reverses that emphasis. People become captivated by angels, by giants, by the Watchers, by the Anunnaki, by hidden knowledge, by mysterious civilizations. Those subjects are undeniably fascinating. We've spent hours discussing them ourselves. But Scripture repeatedly asks a different question. Not who are the heavenly beings, but who is the God they must obey. That subtle shift changes everything. It reminds us that even the most mysterious passages in the Bible were never written merely to satisfy human curiosity. They were written to reveal God's character, his justice, his holiness, his mercy, his sovereignty. Everything else serves that greater purpose. As we move into the next chapter, we'll explore one of the Bible's most misunderstood ideas, the divine counsel. We'll examine passages like Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32, Job, and Daniel, asking what they really reveal about the unseen realm. Do these texts describe a heavenly government? Who are the sons of God? Why does God judge members of his heavenly court? And could these passages finally explain why so many readers have compared the Bible's spiritual beings with the Anunnaki for generations? The answers may surprise you, not because they're more sensational than the myths, but because they're far more profound. If someone asked you to describe heaven using only the Bible, what picture would come to mind? Most people would probably imagine angels with wings, clouds bathed in radiant light, and an enormous throne standing at the center of everything. That's certainly part of the picture. But it isn't the whole picture. Hidden throughout the pages of Scripture is another image, one so consistent that, once you notice it, you begin seeing it everywhere. Heaven is often described as a royal court, not merely a location, a kingdom, a place of government, a place where decisions are announced, justice is declared, and spiritual beings stand before the throne of the Creator. This idea is sometimes called the divine counsel. And before we go any further, we need to clear up one common misunderstanding. The phrase divine counsel does not mean that God shares his authority equally with other gods. The Bible never teaches that. Instead, the image is similar to the court of an ancient king. Imagine the throne room of a great emperor. Generals stand nearby. Advisors wait for instructions. Messengers prepare to carry royal commands across the empire. Officials perform different responsibilities. Yet no one confuses them with the king himself. The throne belongs to one ruler alone. That is precisely how many biblical scholars understand the heavenly court. God reigns. The heavenly host serves. The distinction matters, because without it, passages like Psalm 82 become deeply confusing. Let's open that remarkable psalm. It begins with one of the most startling statements in the Old Testament. God stands in the divine assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. At first reading, many people are shocked. The gods. Doesn't the Bible insist there is only one God? It absolutely does. So what is happening here? The Hebrew word translated as gods is Elohim. Here's where language becomes fascinating. In English, we often expect one word to carry one meaning. Ancient Hebrew doesn't always work that way. Depending on the context, Elohim can refer to the one true God, angelic or spiritual beings, heavenly members of God's court, occasionally even human judges or rulers acting under divine authority. Context determines the meaning. That's why translators must read carefully rather than relying on a dictionary alone. In Psalm 82, many scholars believe God is addressing members of his heavenly court, spiritual beings entrusted with authority over the nations, but condemned for exercising that authority unjustly. The psalm reaches its dramatic climax when God declares, "You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like men." It's a scene of divine judgment, not against humanity alone, against rebellious spiritual authorities. Immediately, the parallels with Enoch become apparent. Heavenly beings, authority, corruption, judgment. Could Psalm 82 be describing the same event? Some scholars think so. Others disagree. Once again, the evidence allows multiple interpretations. But regardless of which view one adopts, one truth remains unmistakable. Every spiritual being in the passage stands beneath God's authority. No exceptions. That's the recurring biblical pattern. Now turn to the Book of Job. The opening chapter presents another extraordinary scene. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Notice how orderly everything appears. This isn't chaos. This isn't a battle between equal forces. Even Satan enters only because he is permitted to appear. He answers God's questions. He receives limits on what he may do. He cannot act independently of divine permission. That's an astonishing theological claim. In many ancient mythologies, rival gods constantly compete for supremacy. The biblical worldview is entirely different. Even the greatest adversary remains subject to God's ultimate authority. This distinction cannot be overstated, because it's precisely here that biblical theology separates itself from nearly every surrounding religious system. The unseen world is real. It is populated. It is active. Yet it never threatens God's sovereignty. That message would have been profoundly reassuring to Israel. Imagine living under the shadow of mighty empires. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Each claimed divine favor. Each worshipped powerful heavenly beings. Each declared its gods victorious. The Bible answers with breathtaking confidence. Above every earthly throne stands God's throne. Above every emperor stands the King of Kings. Above every spiritual authority stands the Creator himself. History doesn't unfold according to the whims of competing deities. It unfolds according to his sovereign purpose. That conviction gave hope to prophets, exiles, martyrs, and ordinary believers facing impossible circumstances. Because if God rules the heavenly court, then no earthly empire has the final word. Not Babylon, not Rome, not anyone. As we continue exploring the divine counsel, another passage will take us even deeper into this mystery. It's found in Deuteronomy 32, where an ancient song hints that the nations themselves were somehow connected with heavenly beings. For centuries, translators debated a single phrase in that chapter. Then archaeologists made a discovery among the Dead Sea Scrolls that changed the conversation forever. And once again, the ancient world proved to be even more fascinating than anyone expected. Sometimes, a single line in an ancient manuscript changes the way scholars read an entire passage. Not because someone discovered a new book, not because a hidden gospel suddenly appeared, but because an older copy preserved words that later manuscripts had translated differently. That's exactly what happened with Deuteronomy 32. For centuries, many readers encountered a verse that said God divided the nations according to the number of the children of Israel. It seemed straightforward enough. Then, in the mid-20th century, archaeologists excavating caves near the Dead Sea uncovered manuscripts that were over 1,000 years older than many of the Hebrew copies traditionally used in Bible translation. Among them was a fragment of Deuteronomy, and it contained a fascinating difference. Instead of reading "Children of Israel," the older manuscript read "Sons of God." That small variation sparked enormous discussion. Which wording reflected the original text? Many modern Bible translations now acknowledge this ancient reading, often rendering the verse as, "He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God." At first glance, it sounds mysterious. What does it mean? Did God assign nations to spiritual beings? Were angels somehow connected with the governance of different peoples? Or is something else happening? The passage itself offers an important clue. Immediately afterward it says, "But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance." Notice the contrast. The nations, Jacob; the world, Israel. Many scholars believe the Song of Moses is describing a moment when humanity was dispersed after the Tower of Babel. Following mankind's rebellion, God allowed the nations to develop under the administration of heavenly beings, while reserving Israel as his covenant people through whom redemption would eventually come. Whether one accepts every aspect of that interpretation or not, the larger point remains clear. The Bible recognizes a richly populated spiritual world. It does not present heaven as empty, nor does it portray God as isolated. Instead, Scripture consistently describes him ruling over an ordered heavenly kingdom, filled with loyal servants who carry out his purposes. That brings us back to one of the most important questions in this entire series. If spiritual beings exercise delegated authority, could they be the same as the Anunnaki? It's tempting to answer too quickly. After all, both traditions speak of heavenly administration. Both describe councils. Both imagine the unseen world influencing earthly history. But let's slow down. Because once again, the differences prove just as significant as the similarities. In Mesopotamian religion, the divine assembly often consists of gods who possess independent personalities, competing interests, and varying degrees of authority. The universe resembles a royal family with political rivalries. One god rises, Another falls. Power shifts through conflict. The Bible paints a radically different picture. Every spiritual being derives authority from God. None possesses independent sovereignty. None threatens his rule. Even when spiritual beings rebel, their rebellion never places God's throne in jeopardy. Think of the Book of Daniel. Daniel receives extraordinary visions describing earthly empires rising and falling. Babylon gives way to Medo-Persia. Persia yields to Greece. Kingdom follows kingdom with astonishing precision. Yet hidden within those visions are hints of spiritual conflict. An angel tells Daniel that he was delayed by the prince of Persia until Michael came to assist him. Who is this prince? Most interpreters don't believe Daniel is speaking about an ordinary human ruler. Instead, the passage appears to describe a powerful spiritual being associated with the Persian Empire. Later, another prince of Greece is mentioned. These mysterious figures have fascinated readers for centuries. Could they be fallen angels? Members of the divine council who rebelled? Symbolic representations of empires? Again, scholars debate the details. But one truth remains constant. Above every prince stands God. Above every empire stands his kingdom. Daniel's visions never encourage fear of these spiritual powers. Instead, they repeatedly assure God's people that earthly kingdoms are temporary. The Ancient of Days remains forever. That's the heart of biblical theology. History may appear chaotic from below. Empires rise. Civilizations collapse. Wars reshape continents. Kings boast of their greatness. But from heaven's perspective, every kingdom has an appointed time. Every ruler answers to a higher throne. Every spiritual authority remains accountable to its creator. That perspective would have been revolutionary for people living under oppressive empires. It remains comforting today. Because regardless of how confusing history becomes, Scripture insists that ultimate authority has never changed hands. Not once. Now, if you've been following closely, you may have noticed something remarkable. We've examined the Anunnaki. We've explored Genesis 6. We've opened the Book of Enoch. We've entered the divine council. And a consistent pattern has emerged. The Bible doesn't deny the existence of powerful heavenly beings. It simply refuses to place them at the center of the story. Instead, every path leads back to one truth. The Creator alone deserves worship. Everything else, whether angels, watchers, heavenly councils, or mighty kingdoms, exists beneath his sovereign rule. In the next chapter, we'll widen our perspective even further. We'll compare ancient Israel with Egypt, Canaan, and Mesopotamia to explore why so many civilizations preserved remarkably similar memories of heavenly beings, divine councils, and catastrophic floods. Were these shared myths, shared history, or echoes of a world that all humanity once remembered before it was scattered across the earth? By now, a pattern has begun to emerge. We've explored the Anunnaki of Mesopotamia. We've examined the mysterious sons of God in Genesis. We've followed the Watchers through the Book of Enoch. We've stepped into the divine council described throughout the Old Testament. Again and again, different civilizations seem to preserve memories of a world where heaven and earth were somehow closer than they are today. So here's the question. Why? Why do cultures separated by mountains, deserts, and centuries tell stories that sound strangely familiar? Is it coincidence? Did one civilization simply copy another? Or could these similarities point to something older, something remembered long before history fragmented into nations and languages? This is where we need to distinguish between myth and memory. Today, the word myth often means something that isn't true. Ancient people didn't use it that way. For them, myths were sacred stories explaining why the world existed as it did. They weren't written as modern history textbooks. They combined symbolism, theology, memory, and cultural identity into narratives that shaped entire civilizations. That doesn't automatically make every detail historical, nor does it mean every story is fictional. Reality is usually more complicated. Imagine a great flood devastating an ancient region. Generations later, descendants tell the story to their children. One family emphasizes God's judgment. Another remembers the hero who survived. A third focuses on the mountain where the ark came to rest. After hundreds of years, the core event remains recognizable, even though each tradition tells it differently. Historians call this shared cultural memory. It's one of the reasons flood stories appear across the ancient world. The same principle may help explain why so many civilizations remembered powerful heavenly beings. Take Egypt. Egyptian religion spoke of a vast assembly of divine beings connected with the sun, the Nile, kingship, death, and the afterlife. Pharaoh himself was often regarded as standing between the human and divine realms. Travel north into Canaan, and we encounter another fascinating picture. Ancient Ugaritic texts discovered at Ras Shamra describe the high god El presiding over an assembly of divine beings. They gather in council. Decisions are made. Authority flows from the highest throne. Sound familiar? It should. The imagery resembles both Mesopotamian divine councils and certain biblical passages. But here's where things become truly interesting. The Bible occasionally uses similar courtroom language, while completely transforming its meaning. The surrounding nations imagined multiple gods negotiating power. Scripture presents one sovereign God surrounded by created beings who serve his purposes. The image is familiar. The theology is revolutionary. Now, some scholars argue that Israel borrowed this imagery from its neighbors. Others suggest the opposite, that Israel preserved an older understanding while surrounding cultures gradually drifted into polytheism. Can we prove either position beyond all doubt? No. The historical evidence simply isn't complete enough. And that's okay. Admitting uncertainty isn't weakness. It's intellectual honesty. What we can say with confidence is this. Ancient civilizations were not isolated islands. Merchants traveled between kingdoms. Diplomats exchanged letters. Prisoners of war carried stories into foreign lands. Royal marriages united distant empires. Ideas crossed borders just as surely as people did. Think about language. Today, English contains words borrowed from French, Latin, Arabic, Greek, and dozens of other languages. No one finds that surprising. The ancient world worked much the same way. Religious ideas, literary styles, and cultural symbols moved alongside trade routes and military campaigns. That doesn't erase genuine differences. It simply explains why similarities exist. Now consider the story of the Tower of Babel. According to Genesis, humanity once shared a common language before being scattered across the earth. Whether one interprets Babel literally, symbolically, or as a combination of both, the narrative presents an intriguing theological idea. Humanity began united. Then it dispersed. If that memory reflects a real historical event, even in broad outline, we would expect scattered nations to preserve echoes of earlier traditions. Not identical stories. Echoes, fragments, pieces remembered through different cultural lenses. That's precisely what many historians observe. Flood traditions, sacred mountains, divine assemblies, ancient heroes, heavenly messengers, a lost golden age. These themes appear repeatedly across civilization that later developed in different directions. The similarities invite curiosity. The differences demand caution. Both matter equally. This balanced approach helps us avoid two common mistakes. The first mistake says, every similarity proves all religions are secretly the same. The second says, every similarity is meaningless coincidence. History rarely operates at either extreme. Sometimes cultures borrow. Sometimes they preserve common memories. Sometimes they independently arrive at similar ideas because they wrestle with the same human questions. The challenge is determining which explanation best fits each case. And that's exactly what scholars continue trying to do today. As our investigation approaches its final chapters, one question remains. If these traditions preserve echoes of humanity's earliest memories, why do modern theory so often transform them into stories about extraterrestrials rather than theology? To answer that, we need to examine how 20th century writers reshaped the Anunnaki into something their ancient creators might never have recognized. There is another reason ancient civilizations often sound as though they're telling pieces of the same story. It's not just because they traded with one another. It's because they shared the same sky. Think about that for a moment. Every civilization watched the same sun rise. The same moon moved through its phases. The same stars appeared above the horizon every night. Long before telescopes, satellites, or space agencies, the heavens served as humanity's greatest classroom. Farmers timed their harvests by the stars. Sailors navigated vast distances using constellations. Kings consulted astronomers before making political decisions. Priests interpreted celestial events as signs from the divine. The sky united the ancient world. That shared experience naturally produced similar questions. Who placed the stars there? Why do the seasons change? What lies beyond the heavens? If powerful beings exist, where do they dwell? Modern readers sometimes forget how profoundly the night sky shaped ancient imagination. Imagine standing in the Mesopotamian desert 4,000 years ago. No city lights, no aircraft, no satellites crossing the horizon. Just an endless canopy of stars stretching from one edge of the world to the other. It must have felt overwhelming, mysterious, sacred. It's no surprise that civilizations associated heaven with divine authority. The Bible acknowledges that sense of wonder. Again and again, the psalmists look upward and see evidence not of many competing gods, but of one creator whose glory fills the heavens. The heavens declare the glory of God. That's one of the Bible's most beautiful responses to the religious ideas surrounding Israel. Where neighboring cultures often worshiped the stars, Scripture admired them without worshiping them. They were signs of God's craftsmanship, not objects of devotion. That distinction shaped everything else. Now consider another fascinating pattern. Nearly every civilization remembered a time when the world was different. The Greeks spoke of a golden age. Mesopotamians remembered ancient kings ruling before the flood. Egypt preserved traditions about the first divine rulers. The Bible described Eden, a garden where humanity walked with God before sin fractured creation. Different cultures, different details, one recurring theme. Something precious had been lost. Could all of these stories preserve distorted memory of humanity's earliest past? Some historians think the similarities are simply part of universal human psychology. Every culture, they argue, imagines an idealized beginning. Others believe at least some of these traditions preserve genuine historical memories passed down through generations. We can't prove either conclusion with complete certainty. But the question itself is worth asking. Because once humanity begins writing history, thousands of years have already passed. Writing appears relatively late in human development. That means countless generations preserved their history through spoken stories. Oral tradition. Modern people often underestimate its reliability. Yet in many traditional societies, oral storytellers memorized astonishing amounts of material with remarkable accuracy. Entire epics were passed from one generation to another before they were ever written down. The ancient world trusted memory far more than we do. Today, we store information on phones and computers. Ancient civilizations stored it in people. That helps explain why certain themes survived across centuries. Not because every storyteller copied the same manuscript, because communities preserved what they believed mattered most. Floods, creation, heavenly beings, judgment, hope. These became part of humanity's collective memory. Of course, memories change. Stories grow. Details shift. Symbolism increases. That's exactly what historians expect over long periods of time. Which brings us back to the Anunnaki. Perhaps the most important question isn't whether they were extraterrestrials, or whether they were fallen angels, or whether they were simply mythological figures. Perhaps the better question is this: what did the people who first told these stories believe they were communicating? That's where responsible interpretation begins. Not with modern speculation, with ancient intention. When we read the Sumerian texts on their own terms, the Anunnaki belong within a richly developed religious worldview explaining kingship, justice, destiny, and the relationship between heaven and earth. When we read Genesis, the focus shifts dramatically. The Bible isn't interested in cataloging heavenly beings. It's interested in revealing the character of God. Everything else becomes secondary. That's why the biblical writers rarely satisfy our curiosity. They tell us enough to understand God's purposes. Then they move on. Modern readers often wish they had said more. So do I sometimes. There are passages where I'd love another chapter of explanation, another conversation, another paragraph. Instead, Scripture leaves us with mysteries. Not because God delights in confusion, but perhaps because mystery has a way of reminding us that finite minds cannot completely grasp an infinite reality. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of this entire investigation. Ancient history is filled with unanswered questions. Some puzzles may never be solved. Some tablets remain broken. Some manuscripts have disappeared forever. Some debates continue because the evidence genuinely allows more than one reasonable interpretation. That's not failure. That's the nature of studying the ancient world. In our next chapter, we'll examine one of the biggest reasons modern audiences think about the Anunnaki so differently than ancient people ever did. We'll explore how 20th century writers, television documentaries, and the ancient astronaut theory transformed a little-known group of Mesopotamian deities into one of the world's most famous archaeological mysteries, and why most specialists remain deeply skeptical of those extraordinary claims. If you had asked the average person in 1950 about the Anunnaki, there's a good chance they would have looked at you with complete confusion. The name simply wasn't part of popular culture. Outside universities, museums, and small circles of specialists studying the ancient Near East, almost no one had heard it. Fast forward to today. Type Anunnaki into a search engine or video platform, and you'll find millions of results. Ancient astronauts, hidden planets, lost civilizations, genetic engineering, secret governments, alien technology. Some video accumulate tens of millions of views. It's one of the greatest transformations in modern historical storytelling. So what happened? How did a relatively obscure group of Mesopotamian divine beings become global cultural icons? The answer begins in the 20th century. During the late 1960s and 1970s, public fascination with space exploration exploded. Humans landed on the moon. Telescopes revealed distant galaxies. Science fiction entered a golden age. Movies and novels filled people's imaginations with the possibility of intelligent life beyond Earth. At the same time, archaeologists continued translating ancient tablets from Mesopotamia. For many readers, those two worlds collided. Ancient texts describing beings descending from heaven suddenly sounded less like mythology and more like potential historical records. Into that cultural moment stepped several writers who proposed a radical reinterpretation of the ancient world. Instead of viewing gods as religious figures, they argued that ancient civilizations had misunderstood technologically advanced visitors. In this view, miracles became machines. Divine beings became astronauts. Sacred mountains became landing sites. The heavens became outer space. Among the most influential voices was Zecharia Sitchin. His books reached millions of readers and permanently changed the public conversation about the Anunnaki. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki were not symbolic religious figures but physical beings from a distant planet called Nibiru. He argued they came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, genetically engineered early humans, and established the first civilizations. It's an extraordinary story. Admittedly, it's also an entertaining one. There's something irresistible about the idea that ancient myths conceal forgotten scientific history. People naturally love mysteries. We enjoy asking, what if everyone has misunderstood the past? But fascination and evidence are not the same thing. That's where historians begin asking difficult questions. The first question is straightforward. Do the original Sumerian texts actually describe what Sitchin claimed they describe? According to the overwhelming majority of Assyriologists, the answer is no. Professional translators who have spent decades studying cuneiform argue that Sitchin's readings often depart significantly from accepted grammar, vocabulary, and context. To put it another way, his conclusions depend upon translations that most specialists simply do not recognize as linguistically accurate. Now, disagreement among scholars isn't unusual. It happens in every academic field. But what's remarkable here is the scale of the disagreement. Historians disagree about many details surrounding Mesopotamia. They argue over chronology. They debate the interpretation of damaged inscriptions. They revise translations as new tablets are discovered. Yet on the question of Sitchin's linguistic methods, there has been an unusually broad consensus. Most specialists reject them. That doesn't necessarily answer every historical question, but it should encourage caution. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone proposes that ancient civilizations were founded by extraterrestrials, we would expect remarkably strong archaeological support. Physical artifacts, technological remains, clear textual descriptions, something unmistakable. Instead, what we often find are highly symbolic religious texts interpreted through a modern technological lens. Take, for example, descriptions of heavenly journeys. Ancient literature frequently speaks of gods descending from heaven or ascending into the sky. To modern readers raised on rockets and spacecraft, such language may immediately suggest advanced technology. Ancient audiences understood those passages differently. They reflected theological realities, not engineering manuals. That's an important difference. Imagine someone 1,000 years from now reading modern poetry that says, "She was my universe." Would they conclude a literal galaxy had become a human being? Of course not. They would recognize metaphor. Ancient literature also uses symbolism, imagery, exaggeration, and theological language. Reading it responsibly requires understanding the literary world in which it was written. That doesn't make the texts less fascinating. If anything, it makes them more profound. Because instead of asking whether the ancients secretly built spacecraft, we begin asking what these stories reveal about their understanding of God, humanity, morality, justice, and the unseen world. Those questions are harder, but they're also much richer. As we'll see next, many of the arguments used to support the ancient astronaut theory depend less on archaeological evidence and more on how modern people choose to interpret ancient symbols. And once we separate symbolism from speculation, the historical picture becomes much clearer, and in many ways even more astonishing. One of the reasons the ancient astronaut theory became so popular is because it asks a question that immediately captures the imagination. How could ancient people have accomplished such incredible things? Look at the pyramids. Look at the massive stones of Baalbek. Look at the temples of Mesopotamia. Look at the precision of ancient astronomy. Surely, some argue, people living thousands of years ago couldn't have achieved all this on their own. Therefore, someone else must have helped them. It's a simple argument. Almost too simple. Because history teaches us something very different. Again and again, archaeologists discover that ancient people were far more capable than previous generations imagined. Take the pyramids of Egypt. For decades, theories flourished about lost civilizations, alien technology, and mysterious construction methods. Yet year after year, excavations uncovered workers' villages, stone quarries, unfinished monuments, tools, administrative records, and evidence of the immense human organization required to build them. The mystery didn't disappear. It became more understandable. Human ingenuity turned out to be even more impressive than the myths. The same pattern appears across the ancient world. Every time researchers uncover another archive, another workshop, or another construction site, we gain a clearer picture of how remarkable civilizations achieved extraordinary things using the knowledge and resources available to them. Does that remove every unanswered question? Not at all. Ancient engineering still amazes experts. There are techniques we continue to study, methods we continue to debate. But uncertainty about details isn't evidence for extraterrestrials. There's an important principle in historical research. A gap in our knowledge is not automatically proof of a particular explanation. Imagine finding an old mechanical clock buried beneath the floor of an abandoned house. You don't immediately conclude it was built by time travelers simply because you don't yet understand every gear inside it. You investigate. You compare. You test. History works the same way. Now let's return to the Anunnaki themselves. One claim often repeated online is that the word Anunnaki literally means those who came from heaven to earth. It sounds compelling. It also appears in countless documentaries and websites. The problem: most professional linguists don't translate the word that way. As we discussed earlier, the name is generally understood to refer to the descendants or offspring associated with the sky god An. While scholars continue debating certain nuances of Sumerian vocabulary, the popular translation used in many ancient astronaut books isn't accepted by the majority of specialists. That may sound like a small detail. It's not. Entire theories can rest on a single mistranslated word. History has seen this before. One mistaken assumption, repeated often enough, eventually accepted as common knowledge. Then years later, careful scholarship reveals the original text meant something quite different. This is why context matters so much. Ancient words lived inside ancient cultures. Remove them from that setting, and they can begin to mean almost anything. Now, does rejecting the ancient astronaut theory mean we should stop asking difficult questions? Absolutely not. Some of the most exciting discoveries in archaeology began because someone asked an uncomfortable question. What was this structure used for? Who built this city? Why do different civilizations preserve similar flood traditions? How did writing spread? Those are excellent questions. The difference is that good historical questions remain open to whatever the evidence reveals. They don't begin by deciding the answer first. That's where genuine investigation separates itself from confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is something every one of us struggles with. We naturally notice evidence supporting what we already believe. We often overlook evidence pointing in another direction. Historians spend years learning how to guard against that tendency. Not perfectly. No human being is perfectly objective. But careful methodology helps. Read the entire text. Study the original language. Compare multiple translations. Consider archaeological context. Listen to scholars who disagree with one another. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Those habits rarely produce sensational headlines. They often produce something better. Reliable history. As our journey approaches its final chapters, one conclusion is becoming increasingly clear. The real mystery surrounding the Anunnaki isn't whether they secretly flew spacecraft across the galaxy. The greater mystery is why civilizations separated by language and geography wrestled with the same profound questions. Where did humanity come from? Why is the world broken? Who governs the unseen realm? Why do we long for justice? Why do nearly all cultures remember a time when heaven seemed closer than it does now? Those questions are far older than modern documentaries. And perhaps they're far more important, because they point beyond archaeology, beyond mythology, beyond conspiracy theories. They point toward the deepest questions human beings have ever asked. In our next chapter, we'll return to the Bible one final time, not to compare it with Mesopotamian myths, but to ask what message the biblical authors actually wanted their readers to take away from these mysterious accounts. After all, perhaps the greatest surprise isn't who the Anunnaki were. Perhaps it's why Scripture never makes them the center of the story in the first place. After everything we've explored, the Anunnaki, the Watchers, Genesis 6, the Divine Council, Babylonian literature, and the debates that have continued for centuries, you may have noticed something surprising. The Bible never seems particularly interested in satisfying our curiosity. That sounds almost frustrating, doesn't it? Think about all the questions we've asked. Who exactly were the sons of God? What were the Nephilim? How much of Enoch reflects historical events? Did ancient civilizations preserve memory of the same supernatural reality? Were the Anunnaki connected to biblical beings? The Bible acknowledges many of these mysteries, but it rarely pauses to explain them in the way modern readers expect. Instead, it keeps pulling our attention somewhere else. Back to God. Again, and again, and again. That's not an accident. It's the central rhythm of Scripture. Take Genesis, for example. Modern discussions about Genesis 6 often become entirely focused on the identity of the Nephilim. Hours are spent debating giants, angels, genetics, and ancient civilizations. Genesis itself spends only a few verses there. Almost immediately, the narrative moves to something the author clearly considers more important. The Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great upon the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's the emphasis. Not curiosity. Corruption. Not speculation. Sin. Not hidden knowledge. Human rebellion. The mysterious beings appear briefly. Humanity's moral condition dominates the chapter. That pattern continues throughout the Bible. Think about the Book of Job. Many readers become fascinated by Satan's appearance before God's throne. Understandably so. It's one of the most unusual scenes in Scripture. Yet Job itself isn't really about Satan. He's present at the beginning. Then he almost disappears from the narrative. The book focuses instead on suffering, faith, trust, God's wisdom, human limitation. The supernatural setting introduces the story. It isn't the story. The same thing happens in the book of Daniel. People often become captivated by visions of strange beasts, mysterious kingdoms, angelic messengers, and cosmic conflict. Those visions are extraordinary. But Daniel's central message isn't hidden codes about the future. It's confidence in God's sovereignty. Kings rise. Kings fall. Empires dominate the earth. Empires disappear. God remains. That's the point. The visions serve the message, not the other way around. The book of Revelation follows exactly the same pattern. Dragons, beasts, trumpets, seals, horsemen. The imagery is breathtaking. Yet the book repeatedly returns to one overwhelming truth. The Lamb reigns. Every vision ultimately directs attention back to Christ. Not to the monsters. Not to the mysteries. To the King. Perhaps that's the lesson we've been learning all along. Ancient mysteries can become distractions if we're not careful. There's nothing wrong with studying them. In fact, I believe exploring ancient history can deepen our appreciation for Scripture. Understanding Babylon helps us appreciate Genesis. Reading Enoch explains why first-century Jews interpreted Genesis 6 the way they did. Learning about Mesopotamian religion reveals just how revolutionary biblical monotheism really was. Those studies are valuable, but only if they lead us back to the Bible's central message. Because Scripture never encourages fascination with powerful spiritual beings for their own sake. Instead, it consistently asks a different question. Who deserves your worship? Not who impresses you. Who deserves your worship? That's a radically different focus. Imagine standing beneath the night sky. The stars are breathtaking. You could spend hours studying constellations, planets, and distant galaxies. There's nothing wrong with that. But eventually, Scripture gently asks, what do those stars point toward? Not themselves. Their Creator. The same principle applies to angels, to heavenly councils, to giants, to mysterious ancient texts, to the Anunnaki. Each topic may spark curiosity. Each may reveal fascinating aspects of the ancient world. But none occupies the center of the biblical story. God does. That's why the Bible consistently strips away the temptation to idolize created beings. Angels refuse worship. Faithful messengers direct attention back to God. Prophets condemn idolatry. Even miraculous events exist to reveal God's character, rather than glorify the miracle itself. In many ways, that's one of the Bible's most distinctive features. It refuses to let the spectacular replace the essential. As we've journeyed through ancient Mesopotamia, one truth has become increasingly clear. Whether the Anunnaki represent mythological deities, echoes of ancient memories, or cultural attempts to explain the unseen world, the Bible responds with remarkable consistency. There is one Creator, one Judge, one Redeemer. Everything else exists beneath Him. Everything. In our final chapter, we'll gather every thread we've followed, from Sumer to Babylon, from Genesis to Enoch, from archaeology to theology, and ask one last question. When the evidence is laid side by side, what conclusion can we honestly reach? We've traveled a long way together. From the dusty ruins of ancient Sumer to the towering temples of Babylon, from the mysterious sons of God in Genesis to the watchers described in the Book of Enoch, from clay tablets pressed by anonymous scribes to biblical manuscripts copied with extraordinary care across generations. And now we're ready to return to the question that started this entire journey. Were the Anunnaki real, and does the Bible know them by another name? The answer is both simpler and more fascinating than many people expect. First, let's begin with what history allows us to say confidently. Yes, the Anunnaki were real. Not as confirmed extraterrestrials, not as scientifically verified genetic engineers, but as genuine figures in the religious worldview of ancient Mesopotamia. Real people believed in them. Real priests invoked them. Real kings claimed authority connected to them. Real scribes recorded their names onto clay tablets that still exist today. In that sense, the Anunnaki are every bit as historically real as the gods of Egypt, Greece, or Canaan. The tablets are authentic. The civilization was real. The beliefs genuinely shaped one of humanity's earliest empires. But history also asks another question. What did those ancient people actually mean when they spoke about the Anunnaki? That's where careful reading becomes essential. The surviving texts present them as members of the Mesopotamian divine order, beings associated with authority, judgment, destiny, and the administration of the cosmos. They belong within the religious imagination of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. They are not described as space travelers in the way many modern theories suggest. That interpretation emerged thousands of years later through 20th century speculation, rather than ancient cuneiform itself. Now let's turn to the Bible. Does Scripture describe heavenly beings? Absolutely. Angels, cherubim, seraphim, the heavenly host, the sons of God, the divine council, the watchers in later Jewish tradition. The biblical world is far richer spiritually than many modern readers realize. Yet here's the crucial difference. Every spiritual being in Scripture exists beneath the authority of one sovereign creator. Always. Without exception. No heavenly council competes with God's throne. No angel shares his glory. No powerful being escapes his judgment. That theological foundation separates the Bible from the surrounding mythologies of the ancient Near East. So, are the Anunnaki and the biblical watchers the same beings? The honest answer is this. We cannot say that with certainty. There are genuine similarities. Both traditions describe heavenly beings. Both preserve memories connected with humanity's distant past. Both exist within cultures shaped by the world before and after the flood. Both reflect ancient attempts to understand the relationship between heaven and earth. Those parallels deserve thoughtful study. But there are equally important differences. The Watchers are defined by rebellion. The Anunnaki are generally part of the established Mesopotamian divine order. The purposes of the stories differ. The theology differs. The character of God differs. The understanding of humanity differs. Those differences matter just as much as the similarities. Perhaps the wisest conclusion isn't that one tradition copied the other. Perhaps it's that both emerged from the same ancient world, while answering its deepest questions in profoundly different ways. Mesopotamia asked, "Who governs destiny?" The Bible answered, "The Lord alone." Mesopotamia wondered, "Who shaped civilization?" Genesis declared, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Enoch warned of rebellious heavenly beings. The prophets proclaimed that even those beings would one day stand before God's judgment. Different voices, different purposes. One extraordinary conversation stretching across thousands of years. And maybe that's what makes this subject so captivating. Not because it proves hidden conspiracies, not because it confirms ancient astronauts, but because it reminds us that humanity has always looked beyond the visible world. Every civilization has asked questions that science alone cannot answer. Why are we here? Why does evil exist? Is there justice beyond this life? Does heaven still watch the earth? Those questions haven't disappeared. They're the same questions we continue asking today. Only the vocabulary has changed. Perhaps that's why these ancient stories continue to resonate. Not because they solve every mystery, but because they remind us that the search for truth is older than any empire, any manuscript, or any civilization. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia still speak. The scrolls of the Hebrew prophets still endure. The Book of Enoch continues to provoke discussion. Archaeologists continue uncovering forgotten cities. Scholars continue debating difficult passages. And somewhere between the ruins of ancient temples and the pages of Scripture, we catch a glimpse of something timeless. Humanity has always longed to understand the unseen. Some search for answers in many gods. Some searched in kings. Some searched in the stars. The Bible points in another direction, not toward the greatness of heavenly beings, but toward the greatness of the one who created heaven itself. So were the Anunnaki real? History says yes, as ancient Mesopotamian religious beings. Does the Bible know them by another name? The evidence suggests something more nuanced. The Bible acknowledges a populated spiritual realm, but it deliberately reinterprets that reality through a radically different theological lens. Rather than identifying the Anunnaki directly, Scripture shifts the focus away from powerful heavenly beings and toward the absolute sovereignty of the one true God. And perhaps that's the greatest mystery of all. The Bible never asks us to be amazed by the servants of heaven. It asks us to stand in awe of the Creator.